Hello, fellow hitchhikers. This is Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea, a podcast with your hosts, Jeff and Bryan. Now, this is going to be your first time listening to this strange new podcast, so I want you all wrapped up and snug and warm and no playing with any naughty bug-eyed monsters.
Sorry, I think we might have been better off with Siri or Alexa.
Right. Who said that? We are not starting this podcast until whoever said that owns up.
Hi there, and welcome to Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea. This is Bryan, and I'm with my friend Jeff, and we'll be talking about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in all its forms. But before we do that, let's listen to a message from one of our proud sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by Digital Watches. Why glance at a pie chart and immediately know how much before or after an hour it is, when you can walk over to a dark corner, push a tiny, inaccessible button, squint at glowing numbers, and do math? Digital Watches, trying to improve the unimprovable. Hey Bryan, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jeff. How are you?
I am not doing bad. So we have now begun the first introductory episode to this endeavor of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and everything that it encompasses. But first, I want to talk about how we met, because you were conducting a job interview, and I don't want to get into the job that neither one of us are attached to anymore. But
no, that wouldn't be so good.
My recollection is we talked more about Monty Python and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy than we did the job.
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt of that.
Yeah. So I was like, oh, he listens to Hitchhikers and Monty Python. Hired. All right. We met 29 years ago at a job interview and immediately started talking about hitchhikers. So that's kind of the reason that we are here now. Earlier when we were discussing this, I said I was never going to just ask you a question and put you on the spot. And here I am, first episode, I'm going to do it, but it's not going to be a tough question. It's, okay. What does Lorraine think of you doing this?
Oh, she's in favor of it. She knows that I like to talk, and she knows that this is one of my areas of obsession, as you indicated. So she thinks it's a good idea.
Okay, well...
How about Denise? What does she think?
Denise, when it comes to me and my obsessions, she likes to hold her finger kind of like pointing down at my desk, and she draws a big circle, and she says, all this foolishness. So this just gets lumped in to all this foolishness.
Okay, so maybe in the back of her mind, that's what Lorraine is doing as well.
It could be, but Denise puts it right there on the surface. So in all of my foolishness that she talks about is my trading card collection. I have way more non-sport cards than I could ever use or even look at. Some of the fandoms that I'm in, Star Trek, we share a love of Star Trek. I happen to like Deep Space Nine. That's my go-to when people say, what's your best? Yours is?
Well, mine's been Voyager for a long time. I'm really a big fan, but I got to tell you, for me, Star Trek can do no wrong. I'm a fan in the biggest sense of the word, unlike some that have a very narrow understanding, and if you don't stick to the original timeline or the original concepts, you're going to lose them. I really enjoy every one of the programs and episodes that I've seen, even if they're not directly aligned with the original canon.
Yeah, I will agree wholeheartedly. There are shows that I've watched with another person and he wanted to end them, and I'm like, no, you can't end this. Like, we'll just get there. Discovery. Discovery is a great TV show. It is not Star Trek of what I think of as a Star Trek show, but it is a good show. It's got the Star Trek name. We're gonna watch it. it doesn't matter. So that's, I think, the same thing that you're thinking.
Well, right. I mean, Discovery is a perfect example of the kind of things that fans hate, where they get in their own minds that the only way Star Trek can exist is the way it existed in its original form. But as they pointed out in Discovery, nearly at the very beginning of the show, that entire ship and its entire crew was meant to be in secret. And as you go through the seasons, they continue to support that concept. And I think they do a fairly good job of it. Plus, they bring in the characters from the original series in the end, and I'm just impressed with the way that they can weave those things together. But we're here to talk about Hitchhikers Guide.
Yeah. Well, right now we're talking about our other fandoms, so people get to know our whole backgrounds of where we're coming from. But believe me, we'll be talking a lot about Hitchhikers. Aside from that, Hercules and Xena, I was a big fan of those. I was laying on the couch late one Sunday night, and this goofy Hercules show came on where he was fighting these rubber monsters, and I was hooked for all 7 seasons. Aside from that, I wanted to come up with a couple of other books that everyone should read aside from the Hitchhikers series. So a couple that I wrote down were Ishmael by Daniel Quinn, Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein, Millroy the Magician by Paul Theroux, The Sparrow by Doria Russell, and Prodigal Summer by Barbara Kingsolver. Is there any other books that you want to throw and add to that list?
Well, that's a good question. Recently, I've been reading some suggestions by other people, and I just finished reading Carlos Castaneda, and I found it very interesting. I always recommend a book, Spell for Chameleon, by one of my favorite authors, and now the name slipped my mind.
Of course it did, yes. That's why I have notes on my screen with everything all written out.
How tricky you are. You actually brought the actual notes. That would have helped, you know. But to talk about books, I think I need to back up just a little bit and say, generally speaking, when I started my reading phase, which oddly enough would have been not until like the 7th grade or so, I read books that other people suggested to me, and my sister was a big influencer on the books that I read. Oh, and by the way, the author's name is Anthony, I just remembered.
Okay.
So I've read a great deal of books that I find very interesting. Stephen Donaldson, I think his name is, has written a couple of books that I really recommend. Necronomicon, I think is the name of that book. It's about the world of understanding ciphers and understanding code breaking, that kind of thing.
We've all seen The Evil Dead. We know what happens when you read the Necronomicon.
Well, you know what? And I'm wondering if that's the correct name of that book now that I've said it out loud, you know? You know what? Now that's going to drive me crazy because I didn't come prepared, so I have my books are in my other room. I'm not in the room with the books, so I can't look up at my shelves.
Oh, good. Even better. I'll keep
asking you more
questions.
I think it's a Cryptonomicon. Is it?
Okay, that might be.
And he's written a number of books, Stephen Donaldson, that I find absolutely fascinating. Gosh, I wish I could think of some of the others that were inspiring to me. Oh, I know. What was that book that I told you to read about the Captain Crunch? Do you remember that story?
I vaguely remember it, but I do not remember which that was.
Okay, well, there is, and I was so obsessed by this, there is such a phenomenal piece of writing that just blew me away to the point that I became obsessed with it, about a bowl of Captain Crunch. And I believe that it's in one of Donaldson's books, and I actually went to the point of getting it copied over into a computer file so that I could just reread it so that I could try to memorize the whole thing. But I'm telling you, if that doesn't tell you how weird I am, I don't know what else will.
Yeah, that kind of sounds like something that I might do. When speaking of authors, I became fascinated by Clifford Simak, who basically started his career back in the late 40s, early 50s, and wrote books through the 80s. It's a guy you never hear of. his works aren't made into all kinds of movies and all of that, but they're just beautifully crafted books, in my opinion. And I remember you have a story about the werewolf principle, which I hope you share in a minute if you remember it. But I have one about one of my favorite, which is a book called Shakespeare's Planet. I have been trying to get Denise to read a Clifford Simak book forever, but she has, like, all this foolishness, remember? That she has no interest in reading any of my stuff. So we were going on a long 7-hour car drive. I've got it on audio. This is a great time to, get her into Clifford Simak. And so I took one of my favorite
you have a captive audience.
Yes. Put it on. We're on our way. We're about a half hour into our trip, and she looks over at me. She's like, did I do something to you that you feel the need to get back at me? And I'm like,
how can you punish me this way?
Yeah, it's like, so what did I do that you're going to make me listen to this for 7 hours? Our Venn diagram of common interest really has a very narrow overlap. But do you remember the werewolf principle story?
I don't. My memory is kind of odd. If you jog it, I probably will remember it all. But the werewolf principle?
Yes, you were probably reading it at work while you were babysitting somebody else, and you were at a spot that was pretty tense, and somebody came in the room or something and scared the bejesus out of you.
Now that you mention it, I do remember that story. It was quite a long time ago.
Oh, yeah, but it's one that I've never forgot because I thought it was great. All right, did you want to get up and go and do something? Is that what I saw you doing?
Yeah, I want to grab something real quick because I want to tell you a story. Okay, so I don't know if I can put this puzzle back together or not. I got my authors all mixed up here. The author of Cryptonomicon is actually Neal Stephenson.
Okay.
That book was actually recommended to me by my father. Once I read that, I became obsessed with Neal Stephenson's books. And the story that I was going to tell you was about another Neal Stephenson book that he just wrote a couple of years ago. Let me see if I can find the name of it, because I couldn't find my book lying on the counter. Oh, right. So he wrote Snow Crash and Athenium, and the one I was talking about was Seven's Eve. And Seven's Eve is a really interesting story. Well, it's about a cataclysmic event that destroys the Earth. My wife and I were traveling together, and it was another audiobook story. We're traveling along, listening to this unabridged version of the Stephenson book, and it starts off where the folks are trying to figure out how they're going to survive this cataclysmic event, which the moon gets destroyed, and then the destruction of the moon results in the destruction of Earth. And so they've got so many years to try to come up with a plan to save the world. And it seems like a normal kind of science fiction-y story because it's talking about, well, we can drill into the earth and we can live inside caves, or we can go to the bottom of the ocean and live at the bottom of the ocean, or we can go out into space and live in space. And most of the story is really about the colony of people that decide to go out into space. You read the book, you listen to the story, and it talks about this group of people that go out into space. And in the end of that sequence of events, only 7 women survive the space travel.
Okay.
They're living out in space, and these 7 women are the last 7 people alive, because the Earth, of course, has been completely destroyed by a hail of comets and that kind of thing.
So those that went into the ocean, they didn't survive.
Well, the story is primarily about the folks that are out in space.
Okay.
That's a good question, and they actually do survive.
Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, it doesn't. I suppose it gives it all away, but what I thought was funny was...
Oh, yeah, spoilers.
Right, your wife and my wife are quite different in that respect. But we're listening along, and, normal travel time, and we're 4, 5, or 6, or 8 hours into the travel book, and all of a sudden, you turn the page in this book, and it's 5,000 years later.
Okay.
I mean, it takes a huge jump from the 7 people surviving in space to the next events in the story. I mean, just an incomprehensible amount of time has passed. And the story then talks about how the Seveneves, as this title of the story is, have evolved, and how their clans, each from one of the 7 women, how they genetically modified themselves and what their progeny are all about. And the folks in space obviously are monitoring the space on the planet, et cetera, et cetera. I won't break anything else up from there, but there's story to be told. But I got the same reaction from my wife that you got from yours when you turn the page and it's 5,000 years later. She's like, what? Yes. Where are all those people? What the heck happened? I mean, what? And I'm like, oh, well, that's a story. That's the way these things go.
Yeah.
The other gentleman that I was talking about was another writer that I really enjoy, and he's got a number of great books about Thomas Covenant, and it's all science fiction stuff, basically.
Oh, all right.
Anyway, where were we? I think I've taken over and lost track at the same time.
Oh, that's fine. We were just talking about other things that people should read, but now let's get to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I have a story of how it was introduced to me. It's long and convoluted, like all of my stories, but I don't know if you actually have a story. So I'll just tell you my story first, because it's kind of approaching it on 2 ends. Back in high school, my friend's brother just could not shut up about The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And because he was my friend's older brother, both of us said, quit talking about The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Nothing could be that good. And we are not going to read it just on principle that you are recommending it. So that's going on. It had to be about the same time that way back in the early 80s, our TV viewing was quite limited. We had basically 6 channels. One of them was the public station, and that's where we would watch all of our Monty Python. We would watch Benny Hill. We would watch Dave Allen, the 2 Ronnies. Well, every once in a while, there would be this show that I would just refer to as the show with the guy in his pajamas. And that was Hitchhikers. But at the time, I had no idea that it was a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I don't know if I turn it on after the, because you're just flipping through the channels, and when you start something in the middle, you're just watching the guy in his pajamas. You're not watching the opening credits to ever see what the name of the show is called. It runs for 6 episodes, and then it's gone for a year before PBS brings it back, and then you're turning it through, and then you catch it in the middle again, and you never realize what it's called. So I think I both liked and hated Hitchhikers at the same overlapping time. Then one Christmas, I unwrapped my present from my uncle, and it was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I'm like, oh my God, not this book. And I'm like, well, I might as well read it. It was a gift from my uncle, so I'll read it. There aren't many books that have done this, and this had to have been the first, where I'm actually laughing out loud while I'm reading the book. Yep. It was that good. And then later on, he gave me the 4th book in the trilogy, which I was then super excited to get, as opposed to when he gave me the first book, which was just like, oh, all right. So do you have any kind of remembering of how Hitchhikers came into your realm of understanding?
Yes and no. As I mentioned earlier, I was talking about the influences of people that influenced the way I read or the books that I read. And I would have thought this was the kind of thing that my sister would have started me on, but she doesn't even care to talk about this book at all. So I know that she didn't read it. And I believe that my first exposure to it would have also been on the PBS channel. And I know that I watched, I stayed up nights and turned it to the UHF channel, whatever I could do to get that channel in tune. Even on my black and white TV, believe it or not, in my bedroom. that I could watch Monty Python. And it had to have fallen around that same time that the Hitchhiker's Guide came out. But if you look back, I believe that was 1981. Around there, I think that the book was released. Isn't that right? Or do you know? Did you look that up?
In October of 1980, the book was released in the United States, and then 1981 was paperback.
Okay. Right. So I can tell you for sure that I read the paperback. I know I did. And I've been looking back because I almost felt like if I had a tangible reminder of the book itself, I could actually remember how I started reading it and looking into it. But the fact is that 81 would have been a pretty transitional year for me. I would have gone off to college, so I would have been back and forth from home. And I know that this was a book that I was so impressed with that I probably gave it to someone to read. And it's not in my library anymore. Many of the others are. But one of the unique aspects of my story with Hitchhikers is that, as you know, with our job that we both shared in various forms, we had a lot of road time. So I have all 5 of the novels in their unabridged version read by the author on audio tape. And I listened to that continuously for years, I believe. So that's one of the reasons why it was easily brought to mind, is because when I had to travel for my job, I easily could have been traveling for 4 or 5 hours at a time. And books on tape were a phenomenal way to keep your mind focused and
that is one thing that you instilled on me, I think, right from the beginning. And you're like, and here are a couple to start you out with. Now, they were not Hitchhikers books. You weren't going to part with those, but no, you part with a Stephen King book. And right. So, yeah, I got hooked on audiobooks immediately. And, yes, I actually have the digital copies of all of them, so I can listen to them on my phone.
Well, oddly enough, I lived in Grand Haven, Michigan for a while, and those books are actually recorded in Grand Haven, Michigan. Or at least digitally mastered there. I think maybe the books by the authors are probably read from their own locations, but books that are read by readers were done right there in Grand Haven. I literally recall driving up to their, well, it was really a warehouse with a reception room, and purchasing books directly from the secretary sitting out in the desk saying, "What the hell are you on? And how can I help you?"
I'm sorry, sir, but
I need this book now. I'm not going to wait till you give it to a bookstore. Take my money and shut up.
You can keep it. Just give me one of those books.
And I did. That's right. I know that those books, The Hitchhiker's Guide, on audio by the author, came out many, many years later. I know that even at that point when I hired you, I was probably listening to those books on tape when driving to Chicago, because Chicago was probably one of my
we were kind of on the fringe of the territory for you. The next thing on my list here to talk about is the name of the podcast.
Maybe we should have started with that, huh?
No, absolutely not. It's the big finish.
Okay.
So the name of the podcast came into my head. I wanted to do this podcast with you, so I was like, well, we do need to give it a name, and I like this name, but I really want to have a discussion of possible names, which then turned into I want to pretend to have a discussion about possible names, but force this one in there to, oh, by the way, Bryan, I've already named the podcast, unless you've got some kind of an absolute objection. But the reason that I took it is, even though the radio series was first, and it's not the first thing of the radio series, of the book, which is the first thing I was exposed to, because remember, I didn't realize it was the Hitchhikers when I was watching it. It's the first joke. And not only is it the first joke, but in my head, it's one of those perfect jokes because there's multiple interpretations. I was looking at a website where somebody was talking about all these years I misinterpreted what this joke meant. And the first thing I thought was, you can't, because the joke is crafted because everybody can put their own interpretation on what it means. So there is no wrong answer. Yes, Douglas may have had some idea, and he has expressed what that idea was. You're making me now do math to tell time rather than just looking at two hands. You've made things more complicated and think it's an improvement. So that was his. What I took out of it is the digital watch was a piece of technology that captivated human beings beyond anything I have ever witnessed before or since. There is no piece of technology that will ever come out that will have people so amazed by as the digital watch was back then. So I've always thought the digital watch, what's the big idea? But, oh man, some people, digital watch. So I don't know if you had that experience, but when I read the joke, where my mind went to is how crazy people were for digital watches, which to me were no big deal, but everybody else thought they were a pretty neat idea. So that's why I wanted to have that as the name of the podcast. Plus, it wasn't taken.
Right. Well, I wasn't going to object to begin with, and I do agree with you that is one of the earliest jokes in the book. And I think that's one of the things that makes reading his material and understanding his logics that is so interesting about the whole Hitchhikers pantheon. As I interpret the idea there, it's not shortly thereafter that he makes the comment that time is irrelevant and lunchtime even more so. I think what he's saying in another essence is that a digital watch is just a representation of a span of time that doesn't need to be incremented. I mean, it's a falsehood that exists throughout any linear life. And that, to me, is part of what makes it really a unique thing in the story. And I do appreciate the title of our podcast, and I hope it brings joy to some folks as much as it has to us.
Yes, me too.
I do have to tell you, I reread the first few chapters of the Hitchhikers before we started. First time in rereading it, I read a line that jumped out at me, which I know we're going to end up talking about eventually. But he mentions that Arthur's friends were all in advertising. I don't know if you picked up on that, and but you really wouldn't, unless you went all the way to the end and back. And I don't know how authors can do that, where they, in the first chapters of the book that has, 5 books and so many chapters and so much content, how he can put a word or phrase or a comment into the beginning of a story and have it wrap all the way to the end of the story.
Yes.
It just boggles the mind, because I don't think he intended it to be 5 books. I'm not even sure what he intended, but it's funny to me that here in the first chapter of the book, he comes back and does a little foreshadowing of the end of the story.
Yes. That's the type of thing that just absolutely amazes me when they do that. The only other thing that I want to talk about is what we're hoping to accomplish with this podcast. Personally, it's an excuse for me to revisit all of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and to experience some that I've never experienced that until I started this, I didn't even know existed. Back in 2004 and 2005, they came up with 3, 4, and 5 of the radio series, and in 2018, they came up with a 6th. I had no idea that they existed. So now, where it was always just the radio series, there's now primary phase and secondary phase and tertiary phase and quandary phase and the quintessential phase and the hexagonal phase. So there are 4 radio series that I have never experienced that I'm going to get to experience for the first time. And I am really looking forward to that. Have you listened to those?
I'm looking forward to it too. I have not. I don't know where exactly I got to in the radio series. So this will be interesting, because I know that I have listened to much of it, but I don't know where I ended it.
Back then in the the early 90s, I would needed audiobooks. Flipping through a catalog, my wife saw the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy full, complete radio series on cassette and bought it for me for Christmas. That was like on a loop. 12 cassettes, 12 episodes, just constantly in rotation. And every time you listen to it, you hear something new. So that is the first 6 episodes are primary phase. You've definitely listened to all of that because I've given it to you. Episodes 6 through 12, which you've also listened to, are secondary phase, which vary quite differently from the book. This is where it takes off and just goes in a completely different direction.
Right, and I know we've talked about that.
So that's why for our absolute first podcast where we talk about content, I just want to do the first 6 episodes, which is now considered primary phase, and we're going to do a whole nother episode for secondary phase, just because it has very little to do with the existing books. And then there's the video game, and there's comic books, and there's the movie, and there's the TV show that we've talked about already a little bit. So I do want to cover all of that. I have no idea what order we're going to do it in. I don't want to do all of the radio series and not get to the books. Well, we'll figure that out as we go.
Absolutely.
All right. Is there anything else that you want to say about Hitchhikers before we go?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I'm hoping that everybody that enjoys the book ends up finding us and can enjoy our lives through our history with it.
Yes, absolutely. So, say goodbye, Bryan.
Goodbye, Bryan.
Oh, you went there.
Of course I went there. You know, Abbott and Costello, that's where it all starts, right?
That's right. Oh. Thank you for listening to Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea. Look for us the first Thursday of every month for a new episode. A very special thanks goes out to Luke, Max, Greg, and Tim Lesnick for arranging and performing our opening theme. We would also like to thank our talented friends and family for their voice work on our introductions and commercials. A big thank you goes out this episode to Jean Berard for her outstanding portrayal of Eddie the Shipboard Computer's matronly personality for our opening. Visit our website at digitalwatchesareaprettynneatidea.buzzsprout.com. You can find us on Facebook and YouTube as Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea. If you would like to contact us, our email is digitalwatchespodcast@gmail.com. Send us a message on Twitter at WatchesIdea.
This has been a Froods for Thought production.